Yeah, so GDP fell by 0.1%. So it's entirely possible this recession may not even survive the typical revisions that we see to GDP data. That said, the economy clearly is slowing. There's a lot of noise in the data. In fact, we suspect that if it hadn't been for some cyclone disruptions, GDP actually would have grown. And we also suspect that the weakness at the end of last year was partly related to labour shortages. So as long as that's the case and the unemployment is low and the job security is perceived to be very, very high, then you'd have to say this is not a full-blown recession insofar as the person on the street would understand it. But as you pointed out, interest rates have risen a lot very, very quickly. And certainly that is making itself felt in the likes of initially construction intentions, for example, but now it is starting to feed through to retail, to hospitality, and for the first time into services. And that is where a lot of the inflation pressure has really been centred. So I think the Reserve Bank will be pleased to see some weakening in that sector.
Yeah, of course, everything that's happening in New Zealand, Sharon, we're all looking at it very closely because we've seen those similar increases in interest rates. But in New Zealand, they were very aggressive and they were pretty early on. You know, the central bank there was one of the first to start really hiking them up. Has there been criticism that perhaps the bank went too hard, too fast?
That is some people's view. Our view, on the other hand, is actually that they will end up needing to do a little bit more. It's important to note that compared with Australia, household debt here is actually quite a lot lower. It's about 25% of GDP lower. It's still high, but yours is phenomenal. So that does mean, all else equal, the Reserve Bank here needs to do more work. We also have a higher proportion of fixed rate mortgages. So whereas the Reserve Bank of Australia can be confident if we don't get you today, we'll get you next month. For the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, the concern is more that if we don't get you now, you'll fix for 3 years and we won't be able to touch you. So I think that goes a long way to explaining the urgency with which rates have been raised here. There's also been quite a different wage growth story. It's also, I think, important to note that although the Reserve Bank has raised rates very aggressively, they're not at high rates compared to New Zealand's history. So on our estimates, the Reserve Bank's going to be sucking about 10% of people's disposable income out on interest on their debt, where for comparison, that's a doubling compared to a few years ago. So that's quite sizable, but it's only 2/3 of where it peaked in the last business cycle. So while the rate of change in interest rates has been very dramatic and quite unsettling for people, it's not true that the Reserve Bank's putting an unprecedented burden on households, not at all.
Great to have your insight into it all. Sharon Zollner, Chief Economist at ANZ New Zealand. Thanks for your time this morning.
Pleasure.